Hello everyone, and welcome to another recorded lecture of BIO1 online. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 12, which is on the forces of evolutionary change. We started talking about evolution in Chapter 1, and evolution can explain both the unity and diversity of all organisms, from the smallest microbes, like bacteria and archaea, to us humans. And just 250 years ago, nobody knew how old Earth was. 150 years ago, still most scientists, even though they knew Earth was millions of years old, believed that there was a divine creator of all organisms. Now, we finally understand, due to an abundance of evidence, that evolution can explain the presence of all organisms on Earth. What evolution does not explain is how life began. So we'll talk more about the origin of life in Chapter 15. But what evolution does explain is how all life has a common ancestor, and it explains how different organisms have different features depending on their environment. So what is evolution? A simple definition of evolution would be descent with modification. What descent with modification means, there's two parts. There's the descent part, and then there's modification. And what this explains is that evolution occurs when there are changes in heritable traits from generation to generation. So there are changes in traits that can be passed from one generation to the next. Right? So we're talking about things that are heritable, right? Things that are inherited, that descend from one generation to the next. And modification implies that these things are changing. And we discussed already that genes, which are transmitted from generation to generation, encode traits, and those genes can undergo mutations, modifications. So far we're piecing some pieces of the puzzle together by saying that evolution occurs when there are changes in heritable traits from generation to generation. Some of these changes are very minor and can occur every generation. We would call this microevolution. So this happens in every population or species, and most of what we'll talk about are referring to microevolution. Some changes are more major and leads to the development of a different species altogether, and that's called macroevolution. So when a species can undergo so much modification, sometimes it can cause the origin of a new species altogether. And remember that a species is one that can interbreed with others. So if you're two separate species, then they can no longer interbreed with each other. So far, all we discussed, we said that evolution can be simply defined as descent with modification. Right? You could see descent with modification when you look at lions and tigers and leopards. Right? They're all very different. They have different modifications, but they all descended from a common ancestral cat species. Right, so there's once this ancestor cat, but with tons of modifications over time, right, they're led to different species altogether. Right, that would be called macroevolution. So what's important to know is that evolution occurs in populations. Okay. A population is defined as a group of organisms of a species living in one particular area at a particular time. So a population is organisms of the same species that can all interbreed. So we could also define evolution as a genetic change in a population's gene pool over time. So that should be underlined and written down, right? Evolution can be defined as a genetic change in the population's gene pool over time. And a population's gene pool is the entire collection of all the genes and alleles, right, of a population. So in the evolution of a population, we're going to see that some alleles become more common in the gene pool. Other alleles would become less common in the gene pool. So what we're going to see is as populations evolve, allele frequencies change from one generation to the next. This happens over time. So we can't just have a population evolve in one generation. And allele frequencies I'm going to discuss a lot more, so don't worry too much about that. But in a population, if you have some alleles becoming more common and others becoming less common, that's evolution right there. Right? And of course, what determines which alleles will be more common or less common is the environment. Right? We know nature selects which alleles are best kept in the gene pool given a certain environment. Right? That's natural selection, as we'll talk a lot more about later. But again, the biggest thing to remember is that evolution does not occur in individuals. One person cannot evolve in a biological sense. And evolution happens over generations, right? It does not occur in one generation. Right? One person's alleles never changes. Your alleles are fixed for life. So if we say that evolution is a change in allele frequencies, then there's no way that an individual could evolve, right? Only populations could evolve. So pause here and answer this rapid response question now. So the answer is A, right? A group of fir trees in Oregon could evolve because that's a population, right? That could interbreed at the same time, right? None of these other options could evolve. So we said that evolution can be defined as how allele frequencies change in populations. So I'm going to give you an example. In the population of Asia, roughly speaking, the frequency of alleles that produce black hair is very high. Right? There's going to be a lot of black-haired alleles in an Asian population. And we can calculate the allele frequency of a given allele. So I can figure out how common is the black hair allele in a certain population. So a simple calculation for that equals the number of copies of an allele divided by the total number of alleles for that same gene in the population. So for every person, for every individual, there are 2 alleles for hair color, right? We know that. So you would have to take the number of copies of the black hair allele and divide it by the total number of alleles of hair color in all the population. And that will give you a percentage of how common that certain allele is in that population at that time. So in the population of Sweden, the frequency of black hair alleles are low. Right? It's going to be a lot lower allele frequency of the black hair allele in Sweden than in Asia. Right? So the gene pool for a population in Sweden differs from that of a population in Asia. So suppose a group of 1,000 Swedish people migrate to Asia and interbreed with the local people. What's going to happen is the allele frequencies in the gene pool of Asia will change. Right? Because now you have humans, which are the same species. They migrated to the Asian population, so that changed the population in a way. And all the Swedish people contributed their alleles for blonde hair. So now the allele frequencies in the gene pool of Asia will have changed. Right? This is by definition evolution. If just a group of people from Sweden moved to Asia, we can say that evolution has occurred. And again, this is over time, and it has to do with the population. It's not just on an individual basis. So remember that evolution is a change in allele frequencies of a population. So in this picture, how can I determine the allele frequency of big D? So how would I figure out the allele frequency of big D? So in this picture, we're shown 25 ferrets. And we can assume that big D encodes for dark fur and little d encodes for light fur. So how to calculate the frequency of big D is to first calculate the total number of alleles in this population. So since there are 25 ferrets in this picture, each has 2 alleles for fur color, we can say that there's a total of 50 alleles. So that's our denominator. How many of those alleles are big D? Well, you would have to just count. You could just tally them up. And if you were to count all the big Ds, you would see that there are 30. So 30 divided by 50 will give us our allele frequency. And of course, another way to think about that, you could just think about this as 60 over 100, because you could multiply both the top and bottom by 2. So without even using a calculator, we could say that the allele frequency is 0.0 0.6. The allele frequency of big D is 0.6. You can figure out the same thing with little d, right, just by counting up all the little d's. And if you did that, of course, you would get 20 little d's out of 50 alleles total. So little d allele frequency would be 0.4. So this is saying, again, 60% of the alleles in this population of ferrets are big D, 40% of the alleles in this population of ferrets are little d. If a bunch of dark-haired ferrets joined this population, evolution will have occurred because the allele frequencies would have changed. So let's do another rapid response question. So a gene has two alleles, big B and little b. If a population of 100 diploid individuals, there are 50 little b alleles, what is the allele frequency of little b? So pause here and answer that question. So we know there are 100 diploid individuals. Each individual has two alleles for a given trait. So that means there are 200 alleles total in this population. Right, that's the first part of the problem because it's diploid individuals. 50 B alleles are present total. 50 little b. So if you did the 50 divided by 200 is 25%. So the frequency of little b is 0.25. And of course, you could figure out what big B would be. You would assume that there are 150 big B alleles. Right? If there are 50 little b, there must be 150 big B. So let's do another one. So pause here and answer this question now. So again, we have 200 total alleles. If 120 of those are little b, right, then we could say that the little b allele frequency is 120 over 200, which is equal to 0.6. So you can automatically figure out that big B, right, would be 80 over 200, because if 120 are little b, that means that 80 have to be big B. And then this would give you 0.4. And that's what 40% is. So the answer is C. So you'll also realize, and I'm going to explain this more, but the allele frequencies always have to add up to 1. Right? So 0.6 plus 0.4 always equals to 1. So before we discuss the theory of evolution any further, I want you to understand a little bit of how we got here. So going back into ancient Greece, over 2,000 years ago, we have theories by Aristotle, who suggested that individuals in a species are basically identical to each other, and species are unchanging. So for over 2,000 years, it was really believed that species are unchanging. They don't change over time. It wasn't until 1749 that a scientist by the name of Buffon started to realize that closely related species might have come from a common ancestor, and they were changing. This was a radical idea at the time. So Buffon was a French naturalist who said that species can change as they spread from their original location. So this contradicted all the previous thoughts. And again, it was very common to believe in a divine creator and that Earth was about 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And that humans were a special, purposeful creation that were distinct from all other organisms on the planet. So now we start seeing some other opinions, right? Some things that contradict the prevailing theory. So now we have another contribution by James Hutton, who suggested that changes in nature are very gradual. Small things change over time. So this is called uniformitarianism. So he said all the mountains we see now, all the sedimentation and the erosion happened very, very, very slowly. So changes in nature are very gradual. Somebody by the name of Cuvier contradicted this. So Cuvier believed in catastrophism, and he said that it's actually not gradual changes, they're brief, violent events that produce changes in nature. So a huge flood or a volcanic eruption or an earthquake were responsible for most geological formations. And Cuvier also helped recognize what's called the principle of superposition. And that suggests that the lowest layers of rock are older than the higher levels of rock. So this was a huge contribution. And Cuvier noticed that fossils represent extinctions from the past. People didn't understand the presence of fossils up until this point. People thought that fossils were failed attempts at life, like life that came from the earth but just never really came alive. Again, that's nonsense, we know now. But it wasn't until Cuvier really said that, okay, species reappear after catastrophes, fossils represent extinctions, and the lower levels of rock are older than the higher levels of rock. So Cuvier's principle of superposition says the older layers of rock down here, right, could be tens of thousands of years older than the newer rock layers up here. And that fossils of extinct species in old layers of rock suggest that living organisms evolved from a common ancestor. So if, for example, I see a species down here, right, I know that it's older than a species I find up here. I'm talking about fossils, right? If I find a fossil down here, this was a lot older than a fossil I would find up here. And I wouldn't be surprised to see if this fossil up here shared a lot of common features from this fossil down here. But there might be some changes because the distance from here to here could be tens of thousands of years. So this is the principle of superposition. So once it was established that fossils represented extinct life, and that species can definitely change, then scientists started coming up with ideas about how species can change. And Lamarck in 1809 came up with the first testable ideas, the first hypotheses about how species actually change. And he said that new species come from existing species through environmental forces. Lamarck's ideas were not proven to be correct, but he would basically say that if an organism used one part of their body repeatedly, it would increase their abilities, and it would allow the next generation to inherit that use of that part of the body. So, for example, if an organism really relies on a long beak, let's say it's a bird, really relies on a long beak in a certain environment, then the next generation of birds will have long beaks because it's needed in that environment. So it's basically saying that the more you use something, the more heritable it will be. We know that's not true, but this is the first time that an idea was even proposed about how species can actually change. And then shortly later, a scientist by the name of Lyell, he's a geologist, renewed the argument for uniformitarianism. So he suggested that natural processes are very slow and steady, and he rejected catastrophism. But Lyell really said that, the Earth must be more than 6,000 years old. Perhaps it's even hundreds of millions of years old. Right now we know that it's 3.8 billion years old. Sorry, it's 4.5 billion years old. So it's a lot more than what he even thought. But Lyell was saying that, okay, nature changes gradually, and nature has been around for a very long time. So it's very possible that natural processes occur slowly, and things do change. So now, all these things taken together kind of set the stage for Darwin. And there was another scientist by the name of Alfred Wallace who also came up with a very similar idea as Darwin. He just doesn't get the credit. But both Darwin and Wallace would argue that individuals in a population are all different, and species arise through the process of natural selection. So now we can start talking about Darwin and how he contributed to the theory of evolution. So Darwin was an English student at Cambridge University, and he completed his studies to enter the clergy but was very interested in going on geological field trips. So he was offered a position as a collector aboard the HMS Beagle in 1831. And he went on a 5-year journey to collect samples and observe different geological formations. And he documented the great variety of organisms in South America and their relationships to fossils and geology. So he noted that forces that uplifted new land, like earthquakes and volcanoes, constantly contributed to changes, and that there was constant erosion that wore the earth down. So he actually, in fact, had a copy of Lyell's Principle of Geology. And remember that Lyell was the one who suggested uniformitarianism, that things happen very slowly. So Charles Darwin was a proponent of uniformitarianism. Things change very slowly. And he began to think that these clues, that these were clues on how new species came to be, right? The origin of species. So Charles Darwin proposed the idea of descent with modification after studying finches in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. And with the help of an ornithologist, a bird expert, Darwin saw that all of the beak types of the finches matched up with the types of foods that they ate. And these finches were collected from different islands of the Galapagos. So the different beak types matched up with the types of foods that were present on each island. So Darwin thought that the different finch species might have all descended from the same finch ancestor. So this was the beginning of the idea that there is descent, right? Descent, there was an original finch, but there was modification as generations passed. So Darwin thought that supposedly there was one ancestral type of finch that had flown to the islands from Ecuador, and that flourished. But over the next few million years, the finch population had to branch out in several directions. If one island only had, let's say, seeds to eat, then only the finches that had beaks that can eat seeds would be able to survive. On a different island, perhaps there was a lot of fruit. So only the finches with beaks that can eat fruit would survive there. So in this way, different natural environments selected which finches could survive. So let's watch a video about this together.
While surveying the islands, Darwin collected samples of plants and animals, including a variety of birds that he believed were of very different species. Upon his return to England, a colleague identified many of the birds as being members of a group of closely related species of finches. Darwin had collected 12 of 14 different species of finches that inhabit the Galapagos Islands. Based on the identification of these 12 species and observations from other destinations along the way, Darwin developed a hypothesis that the Galapagos finches may have all originated from a common ancestral group of finches with the unique conditions on each island selecting for adaptations in finch populations.
So from Darwin's voyage, he saw that the environment of each island influenced the survival and reproduction of the finches living there. Right? So finches with features best suited to a certain island's environment were able to survive and reproduce better than others. So Darwin notes, quote, the preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations. So, for example, on islands that had a lot of seeds, he saw that the finches had crushing bills that can actually crush the seeds. Whereas other islands that had more fruit, they had more parrot-like bills, parrot-like beaks. So again, this is just a difference in the natural environment that selected which finch would be able to survive and reproduce better than others. So let's watch another video to summarize Darwin's discoveries based on his finches.
According to his hypothesis, a flock of ancestral finches flew to the Galapagos Islands from nearby Ecuador thousands of years ago. The islands are isolated from the South American mainland by 600 miles of open ocean. and have different environmental resources, including food. The original colonizing population for each island exhibited variation in beak size and shape, and the islands varied in their food supply. Some islands contained mainly small seeds, others mainly larger, harder seeds, and still others had large insect populations. Finches with larger beaks could crack the larger, harder seeds, but had trouble collecting the smaller, delicate seeds. Finches with smaller beaks could pick up smaller seeds, but had trouble cracking larger seeds. On islands where the dominant food supply was larger, harder seeds, Darwin observed that finches with larger beaks were more prevalent. On islands where smaller seeds dominated the food supply, finches with smaller beaks were more prevalent. Darwin hypothesized that the food supply influenced the characteristics of the bird populations. The birds that are able to gather seeds most effectively are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing their traits to the next generation. This reproductive success is referred to as fitness. Birds that can't feed on the food supply as effectively are less likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, the favorable beak shapes become more common in the population. Darwin connected his observations of finches on the Galapagos Islands with the pigeon breeders in England selecting and breeding birds for specific traits. However, in this case, the environmental conditions selected for specific traits. Traits or adaptations that increase an individual's chance to survive and reproduce are more often passed to the next generation. Their offspring would exhibit those similar traits. Over time, the population would change. He called this process natural selection.
So once Darwin gets back from his trip and he consults with other scientists, he's able to compile some of the observations he made. The first observation he made was that there is genetic variation. Within a species, no two individuals are exactly alike, right? All individuals are different. Some of those differences are heritable and can be passed down from generation to generation. Darwin also observed that there are limited resources in every habitat. Right, there are limited supplies of the resources required for survival. And he also noticed that there's overproduction of offspring, and that in all species, more individuals are born that can actually survive long enough to reproduce. And I just want to make a note that Darwin read a work by Thomas Malthus that was written 40 years before this, that basically said that food availability, disease, and war limit the size of human populations. So Darwin said, shouldn't this apply to all organisms, right? Or all organisms face similar limitations, right? If so, then certain individuals that could not obtain those essential resources would die, right? So basically what this is saying is if you overproduce offspring, only some of them will be able to obtain the limited resources based on their genetic variation. So taken together, he inferred the following. Darwin said that there is this struggle for existence, that individuals must compete for the limited resources that enable them to survive. He also inferred the principle of natural selection, which is that the inherited characteristics of some individuals make them more likely to obtain resources, survive, and reproduce. So this is saying that not every individual has the same chance at reproductive success. Right? Depending on the environment, some individuals will be more fit than others to survive and reproduce. And finally, he inferred this descent with modification, that over many generations, a population's characteristics can change by natural selection, and if enough change occurs, it might even give rise to an entirely new species. So now that we understand a little bit about how nature selects different organisms and changes that allele frequency, right, leading to evolution, we can also see that there can be artificial selection that can change allele frequencies and lead to evolution. So artificial selection could be done by humans. So a plant breeder, for example, might have bred mustard plants with the traits that they liked. So this wild mustard plant, one had very big stems and flowers. So they kept on taking the ones with the biggest stems and flowers and planting them. And then found the ones with the biggest stems and flowers and kept on only picking the ones with the biggest stems and flowers until they saw what we now know as broccoli. So broccoli was artificially selected. It evolved artificially, so to speak, because humans selected the traits that they wanted most. Suppose that wild mustard plants also had large lateral buds. So we might have continually only selected for those individuals with large lateral buds, and those eventually led to Brussels sprouts. Same thing with cauliflower. Comes from flower clusters of the same wild mustard plant. Kale comes from the leaves. Cabbage comes from large terminal buds from this wild mustard plant. So all these vegetables have a common ancestor, but this didn't happen naturally, right? Different environments didn't select for the stems and flowers or lateral buds. It was humans. Humans chose the ones that looked most desirable and then continued to only plant those. And they would destroy anything that did not fit, that looked like broccoli. So this is the same idea of natural selection, but it's artificial. It's also called selective breeding. This was done with pigeons at Darwin's time. So people would select pigeons with the right traits and would only mate, let's say, the fastest pigeons with the fastest pigeons, or the fattest pigeons with the other fattest pigeons. So they would create what they wanted, basically. So this helped Darwin form the theory of evolution by natural selection, because he saw that the environments are essentially doing the same thing as humans are doing here, right? They're selecting for traits that are most desirable to be passed down to next generations. So in artificial selection, a human chooses desired features, then allows only the individuals that express those desired features to reproduce. And people have been breeding dogs for thousands of years, beginning with domesticated wolves. And now we have hundreds of different breeds. Each is a product of artificial selection. Right? So originally there might have been a natural genetic variation, but humans kept on selectively breeding individuals with desirable traits to create what they wanted. And human interference comes with a cost, unfortunately. So there are many health problems that occur in these animals. So dog breeders can select for desired characteristics, but they can't always avoid some of the hereditary health problems associated with each breed. So, for example, pugs like this have very short snouts that make them very hard to breathe when they get excited. They also have misaligned vertebrae, which can sometimes lead to paralysis. So also we have Labrador retrievers could sometimes be blind or dwarf. So again, different artificially selected breeds have health problems because of some of the recessive traits that are naturally found in their ancestors. So while Darwin's arguments were very scientifically sound, he didn't really have enough information to complete the theory of evolution. Now, we do have a large body of research that corroborated and expanded on Darwin's findings. So we now unified a lot of different ideas since Darwin's times into what we call modern evolutionary synthesis. Modern evolutionary synthesis basically states that genetic mutations create heritable variations, right? So again, genes encode for traits. Genes get passed down, but genes can be changed. They could be mutated, right? And those mutations cause variations that can be passed down. And nature selects from these variations. So it's interesting, right, that Mendel was actually discovering the laws of inheritance at the same time that Darwin was publishing The Origin of Species, but Darwin had no idea that genes were assorting the way that they do. And the principle of independent assortment. He had no idea what an allele was. Right? They also didn't understand what genes and chromosomes were. So it wasn't until the 40s and even the 50s when we discovered DNA structure that we understood how the sequence of DNA could encode for proteins and how changing the sequence of DNA can change the protein, right? And proteins encode phenotypes. So different phenotypes might be beneficial in one environment, but very harmful in another environment. So environments select which phenotypes or genotypes are best fit for a certain environment. Right? So now we can actually look at the sequences of different species. So we can sequence all the different finches and confirm, yes, they all came from a common ancestor. And we can actually say, oh, protein X is what encodes for a beak that can crush seeds. And gene Y encodes a beak that can eat fruit better. So now we know a lot about what each gene does. And we can actually create new phenotypes. We can physically alter genes to create what we want. So we've come a long way since Darwin published on the origin of species in 1859. So I'd like you to pause here and tell me, does the following statement support the concept of natural selection? So yes or no. So traits that increase survival and reproduction in the current generation will be more common in the next generation if the conditions are unchanging. So the answer is yes. That pretty much supports the statement, the concept of natural selection. What about this one? Existing natural conditions pressure individuals to adapt so they can reproduce more. Right? That does not support the concept of natural selection. Right? Individuals don't get pressured to adapt. Individuals don't choose what happens to them. What about this one? The environment selects which mutations can survive. And by survive, I mean can exist and can prevail in a population. And the answer to this is yes. This is pretty much what natural selection is saying. The environment, the natural environment, selects which mutations, which variations of an allele can survive. So natural selection molds evolution. Natural selection does not create alleles, right? It only selects for alleles that arose by chance. So this is very important. Natural selection does not create anything new. Natural selection just selects from what's already there. So seahorses, for example, undergo genetic mutations by chance. Suppose there was a white seahorse that lived among pink coral. This white seahorse would have been very easily caught by a predator. So all the white seahorses must have just been eaten. However, and this is a hypothetical example, suppose one white seahorse had a random mutation for a pink protrusion coming out, one of these pink things. Perhaps that allowed this one seahorse with this random mutation to survive long enough to evade predators. The predators didn't find it as easily because it was able to blend in a little better with the pink coral. Well, we know that this pink thing only must have come to be because of a random mutation in the gene, in the genome of the seahorse. And mutations happen all the time, just they happen, right, by UV light, etc. So now that this seahorse survived long enough, it's going to reproduce. And sure enough, the offspring will also have this pink protrusion. And in fact, the more pink protrusions a seahorse had, the more likely it was to survive in this pink coral environment. Thus, only the seahorses with a lot of pink protrusions would survive, would camouflage long enough to survive and reproduce and pass on those pink protrusion genes to the next generation. Again, this is a hypothetical example that I'm simplifying, but this is saying that the alleles that give an advantage become more frequent in each generation. And over time, this can lead to, if there's so much change, it can lead to a different species. So suppose after so many changes, this pink seahorse can no longer mate with a white seahorse. That means they're different species at this point. So again, this is an important concept, right? Nature, it's not like this seahorse said, oh, the environment here is pink, let me turn pink, right? Let me be pressured to turn pink. No, it just so happened that every white seahorse was just eaten, and the one with the random pink mutation was allowed to survive. So that pink protrusion in the seahorse was an example of an adaptation. An adaptation is a heritable feature that provides a selective advantage because it improves an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. So, for example, in a huge population, this woman might have a random mutation that allows for protection against pathogens. This might allow her children to survive long enough to reproduce, right, and not get infected by a pathogen. This flower happens to be very bitter tasting. So it's not eaten by predators, and it can actually be fertilized and grown into a new plant. So different organisms have different adaptations that allow them to survive and reproduce in different environments. And again, natural selection requires genetic variation. There must exist a lot of variants to choose from. So nature has a say, so to speak, in what's most desirable. So since more individuals are born than resources can support, the struggle to survive is inevitable. And this is, again, I have something to say about this that I'm going to talk about after. But this is according to evolutionary theory. Some individuals in a population are better than others at surviving and reproducing. But I want to make a point, right? Is it all about reproduction? What about individuals that don't reproduce? Are they kind of just useless in society? Well, the key is survival and reproduction. And you can't just reproduce and expect your children to survive. In fact, children require, right, it takes a village to raise a child, right? So in fact, if you only were to reproduce, you would just create a lot of different organisms, but not be able to take care of them. So it's not enough to just reproduce, right? You have to have the available resources to allow those offspring to survive. And oftentimes it requires that a population has certain individuals that reproduce and certain individuals that don't reproduce. So those non-reproducers can help support the reproducers and function as a society. So it's often, I don't like that it's always said, oh, survival and reproduction, It's not always just about reproduction, right? It's about the survival part. And of course, it's not just about surviving. We'd like to thrive and get the most out of life. So it's not just about reproduction, right? It's about which can survive and get the most, get the most out of the natural surroundings. So now I want to just watch a video that summarizes natural selection.
By studying the fossil record and comparing anatomical, developmental, and molecular information of organisms, we can see that life on Earth has evolved. Charles Darwin proposed natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. Evolution is a change in the heritable characteristics of a population from one generation to the next. Darwin used the phrase descent with modification to describe the unity of life, that all organisms are descended from ancestral organisms. Proposed in the early 1800s, evolution was controversial because scientists could neither explain nor show a mechanism that resulted in evolution. That is until Charles Darwin introduced his hypothesis of natural selection. Charles Darwin was a naturalist in England, who also raised pigeons as a hobby. He was amazed at the physical varieties breeders produced by selecting for desired traits. In 1835, Darwin was hired as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, a mapping ship that sailed around the world, making various stops, including a stop at the Galapagos Islands located west of Ecuador.
So one more example I want to give you about natural selection is in bacteria. And if anybody ever says evolution is not real, you could give them this example, because bacteria can evolve in just hours. What does this mean? Well, we could use the example of antibiotic resistance to illustrate how evolution occurs in bacteria. Most bacteria would be killed by antibiotic, right? However, there might be just a random mutation in one of the alleles that allows it to survive in the presence of antibiotics. So most bacteria are susceptible to antibiotics, but suppose just by chance there's one bacterial cell that has a mutation that allowed it to survive in the presence of antibiotics. So if I were to administer antibiotics, what's going to happen is the resistant bacteria in red will survive and reproduce. The non-resistant bacteria will be killed by the antibiotics, and they will not. So after just 24 hours of antibiotic treatment, you have a population of bacteria that has a different allele frequency than the starting population. Right? This has a large allele frequency of the antibiotic resistance gene. This has no antibiotic resistance gene. So over generations, right? What is evolution? It's the change in allele frequency over multiple generations. So poof, this population of bacteria evolved, right? And they adapted. The adaptive trait was antibiotic resistance. They're able to survive even in the presence of antibiotic. Right? Without the antibiotic, that evolution would have never occurred because nothing is selecting for this red cell to survive and reproduce. Right? So in this case, what was nature selecting? Right? What is the natural selection? Right? Nature, in this case, was the antibiotics in a way. So that was the natural environment that selected for the antibiotic resistant bacteria. So what we see is that resistance alleles become more frequent in the population over time. Right? And the antibiotics did not create this resistance allele. And the bacteria didn't choose to become resistant. It's important to know that the variation was already present in the population just by chance. And that because the antibiotic treatment was given, these were selected for. Right? All the resistant cells were able to survive and reproduce. What could this mutation be? Well, it could be a lot of different things. Perhaps it's a gene that allows it to, that encodes for a protein that breaks down antibiotics. Right? So if it has a random mutation that allows it to break down antibiotics, then it can survive in the presence of antibiotics. And all of these cells will be able to break down antibiotics. We can go a lot more into that. But antibiotic use is correlated to the emergence of resistant strains. So just 3 years after the first therapeutic use of penicillin, we saw that more than 20% of Staphylococcus hospital cases were resistant to penicillin. Again, streptomycin was approved by the FDA in 1947. Same year, streptomycin resistance was observed. Same thing with methicillin and gentamicin. So bacteria continually evolve to try to keep up with our use of antibiotics. So this becomes a problem because now we have what are called superbugs. And an estimated 700,000 people die from resistant infections every year. So we have to continually come up with new antibiotics to kill bacteria because they keep on coming up with ways. Again, they're not choosing this. They just happen to constantly get mutated. So we have to come up with ways to continually fight off bacteria without them having the chance to fight back. So please pause here and answer this rapid response question before moving forward. So the answer to this question is D. Both B and C are correct. And here's one more rapid response question. You can pause here. And the best answer is C. Bacteria with alleles that confer antibiotic resistance are most likely to survive when exposed to antibiotics. Right. So since environmental conditions are constantly changing, evolution never stops. Right? So as the environment changes, so will the phenotypes that natural selection will favor. So adaptations that might seem perfect in one environment would be completely wrong in another, right? So for example, this polar bear evolved to be very furry, and it could camouflage with the white ice and has all these adaptations so it can survive in the polar, in an Arctic environment. If you put it in Hawaii, this very well adapted polar bear is not very adaptable anymore, right? This polar bear would not be able to survive in Hawaii. Right? This koala bear would not be able to survive in the winter. So again, adaptations might seem perfect in one environment, but it's all dependent on a specific environment, right? It could be completely detrimental in a different time and place. So there's no such thing as like the pinnacle of evolution. It's all relative. So a good example of how species evolve together can be found in this orchid and wasp example. So this orchid and its wasp pollinator have evolved alongside one another for long enough that no other animal can pollinate the flower other than this wasp. And the orchid produces pheromones that attract the wasp. So the flower makes a scent molecule that mimics a female wasp. So the male wasps are attracted to the scent of the flower, and the male wasp will then enter the flower, and some of the pollen from the orchid sticks to the male's body. So the insect will then go to another orchid because it's attracted to it, and will then transfer the pollen from its body to another orchid. So in this way, we have the orchid is getting a lot of reproductive success because you're having help. Right, the wasp is helping create more orchids by going from one orchid to the next. And these have to evolve, they co-evolved, right? Neither the orchid chose to smell like a female wasp, right? The male didn't choose to have a sticky body so it could go and transfer pollen from one orchid to the next, right? This happened together, right? Instead, the orchids that were best suited to wasp pollination were the most likely to reproduce. Right, the ones that smelled most like female wasps were most likely to be pollinated and therefore spread. So again, evolution is not perfect because what would happen if the wasps went extinct? Right, so would the orchid. Right, without the wasp, the wasp evolved so closely alongside the orchid that only that wasp could pollinate that orchid. So if the wasp went extinct, so would the orchid. So the word fitness describes an organism's genetic contribution to the next generation. So the orchids that were best suited to wasp pollination were the most fit because they're most likely to reproduce and pass on their alleles to the next generation. Right? So this is where survival of the fittest comes from. Survival of the fittest means it's survival of the genotype and phenotype that will leave the most copies of itself in successive generations. Right? So it's survival of the genotype or phenotype that will continue to leave more copies of itself in the following generations. So the wasp, so again, we could say that the orchid that smelled the most like a female wasp was the most fit to survive because it was most likely to reproduce and create more of those orchids. Right, so fitness includes surviving, reproducing, and having offspring that survive to reproduce and pass on more copies of that genotype and phenotype. Right? So it's interesting because plants that germinate, grow, flower, and produce seeds and then die within just a few weeks might have the same fitness as a redwood tree that lives on for centuries. And this introduces a very important point because by itself, survival is not enough. Right? It's not enough to just survive. So, for example, this praying mantis, this male praying mantis actually undergoes suicide. It basically offers itself up to be eaten by the female after copulation. So even though the male won't survive, he's giving the female an extra meal that will give a better chance that his children will be able to be born and then will survive long enough to pass on his genes. So even though this male praying mantis is basically dying, its offspring, right, the genotype of this male praying mantis will be passed on. It'll be more likely for it to be passed on because the female will be better fed and will have more nutrients to support the developing offspring. So we could watch a video of this together.
Another male has managed to clamber onto the female's back, and they mate after a relatively short time. The mating can take from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the species. In the case of this African species, known as Phodromantis, copulation tends to be a protracted affair. Once the mating is over, the male is in deadly danger. In this case, timing is everything. In this instance, his fate is sealed. The female was much too quick for him and starts eating her mate alive. This post-coital cannibalism may strike us as extraordinarily callous. But the male is quite simply the nearest high-energy meal around, just right to ensure that the eggs in the female's body mature faster.
So again, in this example, we see that even though the male won't survive, his alleles will survive. And different organisms might favor quantity of offspring over quality of offspring. So in insects, they can produce thousands and thousands of offspring. So they go for quantity, and you don't need a lot of parental care for an insect. But with humans, we often go for quality, right? We need a lot of parental investment, up to 18 years, just to ensure that we have offspring that can pass on our alleles. So different organisms have a trade-off between quality and quantity. So that's the end of part 1. And in part 2, we're going to discuss certain equations that we can use to see if evolution is occurring in populations. So scientists can test evolution. And we can test evolution against a null hypothesis. Right, a null hypothesis is defined down here. You might be familiar with it from psych or other statistics courses. But scientists can test evolution against a null hypothesis that states that allele frequencies do not change from one generation to the next. Right? So we can see if we can reject this null hypothesis and see that allele frequencies really do change from one generation to the next. So population genetics studies allele frequencies and genotype frequencies in a population and looks at how they change over time. So the genotype frequency could be calculated by taking the number of individuals with a certain genotype and dividing it by the total number of individuals. So we gave this example of ferrets before, and let's say that big D and little d both confer the phenotype of fur color, where big D is dark and little d is light. And we can say that big D is dominant over little d. If 36 of 100 individuals are homozygous dominant, we can say that the genotype frequency of big D is 0.36. Right? 36 divided by 100 gives us 0.36 genotype frequency of big D. So that's genotype frequency. We know that allele frequency was counting the number of big Ds and dividing that by the total number of alleles. Right? So at equilibrium, allele frequencies do not change. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is the unlikely situation in which allele frequencies in a population do not change over time. So again, this is an unlikely situation, and it will only occur if a population meets all of the 5 following assumptions. And again, this usually does not happen. So this is an ideal situation. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium will occur if all of the following assumptions are met. And what that means is that evolution does not occur when this happens, right? So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is when natural selection does not occur. There are no mutations in the gene pool. The population is large enough to eliminate any random changes in allele frequencies. Individuals mate totally at random, and there's no migration in or out of the population. We know that, again, this is very unlikely to happen because we know natural selection does occur. There are mutations that always happen. Populations are not always large enough. Individuals don't mate randomly. We actually choose who to mate with. We don't just pick a lottery and just decide to have kids with somebody. And we do travel a lot. There is migration in and out. So at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we could say if all of these assumptions are met, then allele frequencies would not change between generations, right? And evolution would not occur. So Hardy and Weinberg were both mathematicians that came up with equations that could represent the relationship between allele frequencies and genotype frequencies. And these two equations could only be used if all of the assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium are met. So these are the equations you have to know. And again, this might not make sense right off the bat. You might have to repeat it a couple of times. So assume there are 2 alleles of a gene. There's P and Q. Both alleles, both frequencies of a gene must equal to 1. P is the frequency of the dominant allele, and Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. Both of those numbers, both of those allele frequencies have to add up to 1, right? Assuming there's a dominant allele and a recessive allele, we always say P is the frequency of the dominant allele. Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. And P plus Q always equals 1. So since the D gene has 2 alleles, big D and little d, the frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele must equal 1. And we know from the example before, that we can count all 25 ferrets, and we know that there's a total of 50 alleles. Since 30 out of the 50 alleles are big D, the allele frequency for big D is 30 over 50. The allele frequency for D is 30 over 50. And this is represented as the letter little p. Right? Little p is the frequency of the dominant allele. So big D is the dominant allele. We said there are 30 big Ds out of 50. So P is 0.6. Right? So in this case of the ferrets, P is 0.6. The frequency of the dominant allele, big D, right? There are 30 big D alleles out of 50 total alleles. Therefore, P equals 0.6. Just from this equation, we can figure out what Q is. Right? Q must be 0.4. If you don't believe me, you can still count all the little d's, and you'll see that there are 20 little d's out of 50 total alleles, and that will give you Q, right, the frequency of the recessive allele being 0.4 in this example. So P plus Q equals 1, where P is the frequency of the dominant allele and Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. Using this equation, we can also calculate the genotype frequencies that would be found at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Multiplying the frequency of the dominant allele by itself gives the frequency of a homozygous dominant individual in the next generation. Right? So again, let's just think about random let's think about it as a math problem. If you have a certain proportion of the frequency, a certain proportion of alleles are dominant, right? That's P. So what is the chance of getting 2 dominant letters? Right? What is the chance of getting 2, this and that? So that would be P squared. Right? You're taking the frequency of the dominant allele and multiplying it by itself. And that's the probability of getting a homozygous dominant genotype. If I multiply the frequency of the recessive allele by itself, Q, that will give me the frequency of homozygous recessive individuals in the next generation. So Q squared is the homozygous recessive genotype. Right? What is the likelihood of getting 2 little d's? Well, it's Q times Q. Right? It's the allele frequency of the recessive allele multiplied by itself. So now we have Q squared gives us the homozygous recessive genotype frequency. The frequency of the dominant allele times the frequency of the recessive allele times 2 will give us the frequency of heterozygous individuals in the next generation. So 2pq represents the frequency of the heterozygous genotype. So now we have P squared is the genotype frequency for homozygous dominant genotypes. Q squared is the genotype frequency for the homozygous recessive genotype. And 2p squared is the genotype frequency for the heterozygous genotype. And this could be explained. These numbers, again, this 2pq, I'm going to explain it in the next slide a little bit more. But taken together, we have another very important equation that you must memorize, and that's P squared, plus 2pq plus Q squared equals 1. That means that if I take all the homozygous dominant individuals, all the heterozygotes, and all the homozygous recessive, that should all equal to 1. And the way that we got this, right, was from the allele frequency equation. Right, so the allele frequency, this is what you must remember. P plus Q equals 1 is the equation to represent allele frequencies. This tells us the frequency of the dominant and the recessive allele. This equation tells us genotype frequencies. This tells us the likelihood of getting homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive individuals. So, assuming Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium in the ferrets, and we said that big D is dark fur and little d is light fur, if the allele frequency of big D is 0.6, how many ferrets in a population of 100 should have a heterozygous genotype? So pause here, and you can do this just by the information given on this slide. So our first equation says that P plus Q equals 1. And we said P is the frequency of the dominant allele. And it already says the allele frequency of big D, the dominant allele, is 0.6. So the first thing we're going to write down is P equals 0.6. That's right here. And since P plus Q equals 1, we know that Q equals 0.4. So there's our first, this is the allele frequencies equation. So now we solve for P and Q. Great. We actually are asked about a genotype frequency. Right? We're asking how many should have a certain genotype. So for that, we have to use this equation, the genotype frequencies equation. It's P squared plus 2pq plus Q squared equals 1. And specifically, we said P squared is the frequency of the big D genotype, 2p squared is the frequency of big D little d, Q squared is the frequency of little d. We're asked about the heterozygous genotypes, which are represented by 2pq. So in order to figure that out, I have to take 2 times P, which was 0.6, times Q, which is 0.4, and that gives me the answer of 0.48. And sure enough, that is the answer because it expects 0.48 represents 48% of the individuals will be heterozygous if the allele frequencies were as shown. So this means the answer to my question is that 48 out of 100 ferrets should be heterozygous. And this could be explained by a Punnett square. Suppose we have, in reproduction, we have two heterozygotes, and we said the frequency of big D is 0.6. The frequency of little d is 0.4. So now, and again, here's 0.6, allele frequencies, and this is 0.4. And remember what allele frequencies mean. This means if the allele frequency is 0.6 for big D, that means 60% of the male ferret's sperm carry the big D allele for dark fur, and 40% of the male sperm carries the little d. Same thing with the eggs. 60% of females' eggs have big D, 40% of females' eggs have little d. So what we're doing is basically applying these equations to a Punnett square. So what is the chance that a big D egg will be fertilized by a big D sperm? Well, we can multiply 60%, 0.6 times 0.6. And that gives us the answer of 0.36. That's p squared, right? Getting a big D from mom and a big D from dad is like using the product rule. It's 0.6 times 0.6, which is the same thing as saying p squared, right? 0.6 squared. That gives us 0.36. Same idea of heterozygotes. We can have a big D sperm fertilize a little d egg. That's 0.6 times 0.4 is 0.24. Or you can have a little d sperm fertilize a big D egg and still get that heterozygote of 0.24. That explains why we have to multiply p times q by 2, because you can either get the big D from the sperm or from the egg. So it's 2p squared that represents the heterozygotes, or 0.24 plus 0.24, which gave us the 0.48. Finally, a little d sperm can fertilize a little d egg, and that's 0.4 squared, or 0.16, and that's what gives us that q squared. So if that doesn't make sense right now, I suggest going over this example many times before moving forward. So far you should understand how to utilize both of these equations, and how it kind of makes sense, how the equation makes sense given this Punnett square. So remember that in reality, allele frequencies always do change, right? A population at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium does not evolve, but a real population would always violate the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium when any of the following occurs. Natural selection or mutations, those happen all the time. So you can't, if natural selection and mutations occur, you can't use these equations. Random changes in allele frequencies are common because of migration in and out of a population, right? Or because of mutation. Individuals rarely mate at random, right? People select organisms select specific mates based on selection criteria. They don't just randomly come up to somebody and decide to mate. And there's always some level of migration between populations. So since all these events are common, we know that we can't really use these equations to tell us whether evolution is occurring, right? So it's more of the Hardy-Weinberg could serve as a basis of comparison to reveal when evolution is occurring, right? So we can use it to basically either reject or support a null hypothesis that's saying no evolution is occurring. So again, Hardy-Weinberg has its limitations, so that's important to understand. So it's hard to use Hardy-Weinberg in a real population. So I'd like you to watch the video contained in the ebook on Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium now before moving forward. And now we will do a first sample of a Hardy-Weinberg problem in this rapid response question. So pause here and try your best to get the answer on your own. So we're told that there's a population of 100 starfish in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and the trait for long arms is completely dominant to the trait for short arms. In this population, 40% of the alleles are recessive, 60% of the alleles are dominant. So the first thing we do is write what we know down. We're told already the allele frequencies. We're told that 40% of the alleles are recessive and 60% are dominant. We know from there that P, the frequency of the dominant allele, must be 0.6. And that for Q must be 0.4. So the question asks, how many individuals would you expect to be homozygous dominant? So you have to remember that homozygous dominant is represented by P squared. So you would have to do P squared, 0.6 times 0.6, which is 0.36. So of 100 starfish, you would expect that 36 would be homozygous dominant genotype. In a species of zebra, one gene controls whether the zebra has stripes, with the striped allele being dominant. You find a herd of 1,000 zebras, and 250 of those lack stripes. What are the frequencies of the dominant and recessive alleles? So don't even look at the answers because it might confuse you. I want you to pause here and think of the answer before looking at the choices. So this is a little tricky. So you have to figure out first what we know, like what information can we take away from the word problem. So we have 1,000 zebras, 250 lack stripes. And we know that if you lack stripes, you must be homozygous recessive because the striped alleles are dominant. So this gives us a clue. 250 out of 1,000, right, lack stripes, meaning those are homozygous recessive. So therefore, we know Q squared is homozygous recessive. So Q squared must equal 250 divided by 1,000. 250 divided by 1,000 is the same thing as 0.25. So Q squared is 0.25. And using a calculator, you can do the square root of 0.25 and figure out, or you could do it in your head, and you'll realize that Q is 0.5. If Q is 0.5, that means P has to be 0.5 also. And the answer is C. And with this information, you could answer a lot of different questions. So I could say, how many of 1,000 zebras would be heterozygous? So then you would have to do 2PQ, right? You would have to take P times Q and multiply it by 2. And that would also give you, the answer would be 500 would be heterozygous. 500 of those 1,000 zebras would be heterozygous. So those are the kinds of problems you're going to be asked to solve on a quiz or exam. And again, what Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is telling us, that if all of those assumptions are met, that all of these zebras will always have the same proportion of striped to non-striped. And all the genotypes, the frequencies will stay the same from generation to generation. Right? That's what Hardy-Weinberg is telling us. Right? There will always be 50% heterozygotes of these zebras. But we know that as long as the second that there's a mutation in the striped gene, or new striped zebras join the population, or zebras start choosing their mates based on whether they have stripes or not, we can't assume that the allele frequencies and genotype frequencies would stay the same. And we can only assume that they stay the same if all of those Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium assumptions are met. And again, that rarely happens. So that's why we can't usually apply it to real populations. But it's important, it's good to know that if they are at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, how to figure out the allele frequencies and genotype frequencies. So of all the mechanisms by which populations can evolve, natural selection is probably the most important. And we say that natural selection changes the genetic makeup of a population by favoring the alleles that contribute to reproductive success and selecting against those that do not. There are 3 modes of natural selection that are distinguished by their effects on the phenotypes in a population. So we're going to talk about directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. The first is called directional selection, and that's where one extreme phenotype is favored over another. So one extreme phenotype is fittest, and the environment selects against the other. So a good example of this is in the peppered moth. So before the Industrial Revolution, trees were generally light-barked, had light bark. So the lighter moths were favored in phenotype because they would be less likely to be eaten because they would camouflage in with the light-barked tree. And the environment selected against dark moths. But what's interesting is that after the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of coal and soot in the environment, and that actually caused the trees to be darker. And that switched directional selection. In this case, it was actually the darker moths that were favored because they could blend in with the trees better, and now the white moths were selected against. So again, this is directional selection because one extreme was favored as opposed to another. Right? So in this case, at first maybe there was no difference, but as the habitat changed and as the trees darkened, actually the darker moths were selected for, and the lighter moths were all eaten. So in this way, there is a direction to selection. It's toward one extreme. Disruptive selection favors extreme phenotypes, where the intermediate phenotype is selected against. So basically, this is saying extremes are preferred. It's also called diversifying selection. So suppose that there's a population of snails that live on white barnacles and dark brown rock. Well, either very, very light snails or very dark snails would be able to camouflage and blend in. The intermediate colored snails would stand out on either the white barnacles or the dark rock. Right? So the dark rock could camouflage, the dark snails could camouflage against the dark rock. The light snails can camouflage against the barnacles, but these medium colors cannot camouflage at all. So either the light snails are selected for or the dark are selected for. The intermediate are selected against. Right, that's disruptive selection. And finally, there's stabilizing selection. That's the third form of natural selection, also called normalizing selection, and this favors the intermediate phenotype. Right? In stabilizing selection, the extreme phenotypes are less fit than the intermediate phenotype. A good example of this is in human babies. So medium-sized babies survive more than very large babies or very small babies. Very large babies are unable to be delivered usually. They won't be able to go through the birth canal. Very small babies would be premature, right, and would not be able to reach reproductive age. So therefore, we stabilize. We want to select for the medium, the intermediate. Medium birth weight is the most reproductively fit. So these three models of natural selection may seem to suggest that for each trait, only one or a few of the beneficial alleles will end up persisting in a population, because the harmful alleles will always be selected against. But it turns out that harmful alleles can still persist in a population. For some genes, natural selection maintains what's called a balanced polymorphism, in which multiple alleles of a gene are always present in a population. One way that some harmful alleles can persist in a population is due to the heterozygote advantage, in which a heterozygote is favored over either homozygote. And a very good example of the heterozygote advantage is with sickle cell disease in humans. So we know that the sickle cell allele is harmful. It causes sickle cell disease, which can be pleiotropic. It has a very devastating effect on the whole body because of one mutated copy of hemoglobin. Right? That's what the sickle cell allele. So if you have we said sickle cell disease is a recessive, homozygous recessive disorder. You need to have two bad copies of hemoglobin to have sickle cell disease. However, if you have only one copy of the sickle cell allele, you have an advantage. Because if you're a heterozygote for the sickle cell allele, you don't have sickle cell, but you're resistant to malaria. This is a really interesting example. So people who are carriers for sickle cell disease are resistant to malaria. And this could explain why there's such a high percentage of sickle cell anemia, right, where there's a high percentage of mosquitoes. So this is the distribution of malaria, and you can see that there's a high proportion of sickle cell disease in a population where there is malaria. So a lot of these populations, a lot of these people that are carriers for sickle cell disease have a benefit, right? It's the heterozygote advantage because they're not going to get malaria. But if two of those heterozygotes have a child, we know that there's a 25% chance that they're going to get a child with sickle cell disease. So this is what explains why there's a prevalence of sickle cell, a lot of sickle cell disease in certain parts of Africa. Right. So again, heterozygotes have low chance of malaria and no sickle cell disease. If you have little d, you have sickle cell disease. And if you have big D, you have high susceptibility to malaria. So the best option is to get big D, little d. That's the heterozygote advantage. Of course, this is not advantageous if you don't have any mosquitoes that carry malaria. Right, so it depends on your specific environment. So there's another example of a heterozygote advantage in cystic fibrosis. We know that cystic fibrosis is another recessive disorder that results when you have two dysfunctional copies of the CFTR protein. If you only have one bad copy of the CFTR protein, that makes you resistant to cholera toxin. So again, it's an advantage to be a carrier for cystic fibrosis because you would be immune to cholera toxin. But again, it gives you more of a chance of having a child that has cystic fibrosis. So a heterozygote has a fitness advantage over both types of homozygotes. And that's what allows the harmful allele to remain in the population. So this explains why we still have cystic fibrosis alleles and sickle cell alleles in different populations. So pause here and try to answer this rapid response question. So the answer to this is C, directional selection. Right, so as humans migrated out of Africa and toward Northern Europe, reduced exposure to UV light selected for lighter skin color. So this is one extreme is favored. So that's an example of directional selection. So in many vertebrate species, the sexes look alike. So you can't really tell a difference between a male and female dog. Off the bat. However, in some species, natural selection can maintain what's called sexual dimorphism, where males and females appear very different from one another. And we can think about like a peacock that has very flashy feathers, or you can think about certain birds that use a lot of energy to build complex nests. Right? So all of these seem to kind of counteract and go against what we just learned about natural selection. Right? Because you would think that the showiest bird might be eaten by a predator, right? Or it might be that if you spend so much time building a complex nest, you won't be able to take care of your young. So how can natural selection allow for these traits that apparently reduce survival? Well, it turns out that sexual selection is a type of natural selection that results from the variation in the ability to obtain mates. And this occurs in two main forms. There's intrasexual selection and intersexual selection. So there could be competition between males and females for access to the opposite sex, or you can have one sex selecting the most attractive mate of the other sex. So we'll talk about both types of sexual selection. The first we said was intrasexual selection, and that's where the members of one sex compete amongst themselves for access to the opposite sex. So certain male bighorn sheep, for example, use their horns to battle for the right to mate with multiple females. And the strongest ram is therefore most likely to pass on their alleles. So in this case, the weaker individuals are denied access, so to speak. In some populations, individuals choose the best mates of the opposite sex. That's called intersexual selection, right? Where members of one sex choose mates with the highest quality features of the opposite sex. So this is a good example of in birds of paradise. Female birds of paradise prefer very brightly colored males, and only the brightly colored males are able to reproduce. Same thing with the peacocks. And because the brightest males get the most opportunities to mate, the alleles that confer those bright colors will be more common in the population. And it's important to note that intersexual selection is not fixed. So this is very much based on society, and what society tells us is attractive. So at one point, this might have been the most attractive male for the average woman, where at a different time in history, this might have been the most attractive male for a woman. And again, I'm talking about just heterosexual in terms of mating now. And again, a lot could be said in a sociology class. Now I'm just talking strictly biology. So intersexual selection, again, might change over time, right? What's favorable in one generation might not be favorable in the next generation. So it's not like a fixed rule. So a question arises, why do males usually show the greatest effects of sexual selection? Right? Why is it the male peacock that exhibits these colorful feathers and not the peahen? So in most, but not all, vertebrate species, it is the female that spends a lot more time and energy on taking care of the offspring than do the males. And because of this very high investment in reproduction, right, you need to not only invest in an egg, which is a lot more expensive, so to speak, than sperm, but then you have to carry the child in many cases, and then nurse the child in the case of mammals, and then basically take care of it, and for many years in the case of many mammals. Right? So the females have a lot higher investment than the males do. So the males are typically less choosy than females, and then therefore must compete for access to females. This is, again, a biological explanation, and this is a hypothesis. We're not sure if this is true. It's still an open question. Right? You can say, like, why are these feathers attractive to a female? So we can't ask the peacocks and the peahens themselves why they look the way they do, but we could imagine that since colorful feathers take so much time and energy to maintain, that only the peacocks that were very healthy and had a really good immune system and had everything else going for them were able to have all the energy put into their colorful decorations. If there were a peacock that were sickly and did not have a good immune system, it would not be able to put in all the energy to maintain its colors. Same idea could be applied to, let's say, muscular men. Like, why would muscular men be favored today? Well, there's really no benefit, right? Back in the day, maybe it was better to be strong. But now we know that, well, I don't even want to use the case of a president, but you don't need to be strong to have power, right? It's actually a lot better to have a brain that works better than muscles. But why do some people still go for, are still attracted to muscles? Well, it could be because in order to get muscles, you have to have a lot of time and energy to expend. And if you were sick, you would not be able to build so much muscle. So indirectly, muscles might be an indirect sign of health. I would say that's very deceptive, actually, because again, this is getting too much into sociology maybe. But again, these are algorithms that might have stayed with us from yesteryear that tell us to be attracted to one thing or another, but really have no basis in reality. So sexual selection may cause evolution. It's only one part of the story, right? That individuals with the sexually selected trait will mate most and therefore pass along their genes most, right? Since we know mating is not random, right? They're choosing a mate based on specific characteristics. And that may cause evolution. Remember that sexual selection is just one type of natural selection, right? Sexual selection is not the whole story. There are other factors that play a role in mating. And even once you have the child, like I suggested before, it's not enough. You have to have enough resources to take care of the child. And furthermore, sex is not just for reproduction. Especially in the case of mammals, sex is often used for conflict resolution and for cooperation. So sex is often looked at, or was often looked at in biology as strictly means of reproduction. But now we know, especially in the cases of primates like humans and bonobos, sex is also used for cooperation and conflict resolution, and has nothing to do with natural selection in that case. There's a new theory that can replace sexual selection with social selection. And the idea would be that in social selection, that males and females interact socially to acquire opportunities for reproduction. Right? This is not just about sex and reproduction. It's about how do we acquire the best opportunities to reproduce and raise offspring together. Right? So socialization allows for access to resources that enable the production and survival of the next generation. Right? In this case, it's not just about which man is attracted to which female to make babies. Right? It's about which groups of people can come together to form the best societies that can together raise offspring to survive and reproduce and pass on the group's genes. Right? So I think social selection is a little better sounding. And this is, again, more sharing is caring, right? It's not all survival of the fittest, death of the weakest. It doesn't always have to be that catastrophic sounding. We actually know that it's better to cooperate. The reason why we exist is because of our ability to cooperate in large groups. And in fact, it feels good to share. We get rewarded in our brains. It feels good to be kind because we depend on kindness and cooperation for the longevity of our species. So just like it feels good to eat and it feels good to have sex, those are things that promote survival. It also feels good to be kind and it feels good to cooperate because those things are also important for survival. So it's important to not always think about the struggle for existence. There's also a snuggle for existence, right? There's a lighter side to it. We're always looking to cooperate, and we always want to belong in a group as social mammals. So there's also this snuggle for existence and this drive for cooperation and kindness, not always this competition and dog eat dog type of mentality that we're taught. So up until this point, we've been talking about natural selection as being responsible for the adaptations that enhance survival and reproduction. But that's not the only mechanism of evolution. So mutations can also fuel evolution. And we know that mutations are just a change in an organism's DNA sequence. And that can introduce a new allele into a population. That allele can be harmful. In that case, it would be selected against. Many changes would be harmless and would be neutral. So many traits that change are not even beneficial or harmful and just kind of don't change at all. And some are actually beneficial and might be selected for in a certain case. And our DNA is always getting mutated, but DNA polymerase does repair any mutations. But the average rate of mutation is about 1 per every billion DNA letters gets mutated. And at first it might seem like that's way too low to actually cause any change in evolution. But remember that each genome has 3 billion base pairs, each cell, and there's a large number of cell divisions that occur throughout life. So every time a cell divides, there's another opportunity for mutation. So the beneficial mutations would be passed on to the next generation. So their frequency would increase over time. And again, this beneficial mutations would be passed on to the next generation only in asexual reproduction, like a bacterium, for example. As a bacteria splits in half, both daughter cells will be identical. But we know that in a multicellular organism, a mutation can only pass to the next generation if it's in a germ cell that would give rise to gametes, like sperm or egg. So we said overall, mutations create genetic diversity. We need a lot of diverse things for nature to select from. And without mutations, evolution would not occur because there would be no diversity to select from.
Although Darwin could not have known this, the size and shape of a finch's beak is determined by multiple genes inherited from the parents. Mutations in the genes lead to new alleles, which are versions of a gene. These different alleles influence the size and shape of the finch's beaks. These alleles can be passed from parent to offspring. Offspring that receive the small beak alleles tend to have smaller beaks. Those receiving the large beak alleles will tend to have larger beaks. Because the beak size and shape are influenced by multiple genes with multiple alleles, there can be a large amount of genetic variation in a population, which can lead to various phenotypes. Natural selection acts on phenotypic variation. In a small population, allele frequencies can change rapidly due to natural selection. As descendants of the ancestral finches migrated to adjacent islands, they carried their alleles for beak size and other characteristics. The environmental conditions, including the food sources on each island, influenced the reproductive success of the birds, such that over time the population changed. After many changes accumulated in a population, it gave rise to a separate species. In the case of the Galapagos finches, the process of speciation occurred many times, producing the 14 species of finches currently found on the Galapagos Islands.
So another way to change allele frequencies is by genetic drift. So genetic drift is basically random sampling error. And unlike mutation, which contributes to more diversity, genetic drift tends to eliminate diversity from a population. So in sampling error, we're saying the sample does not represent the larger group. We're eliminating the full diversity of the larger group. So allele frequencies can shift dramatically and oftentimes become eliminated when only part of a population survives to reproduce. So I'm going to give you a simulation to give you an example of what genetic drift really means. Suppose I have a jar with 50 blue marbles and 50 yellow marbles. If I selected 10 at random, I would imagine that 5 should be yellow and 5 should be blue. But suppose suppose just by random chance, I selected 7 yellow and 3 blue. If I were to restock my jar based on this sample, so I would say 70% of the beads would be yellow and 30% would be blue, and I then selected 10, then I would be even more inclined to get more yellows. So I would have 9 yellows to every 1 blue. If I were to restock the jar and one more time to represent this allele frequency, if I were to select 10, it's possible that I'm only going to get yellow. And this way, my blue allele was completely eliminated from the population just by random chance. Right? So again, this is sampling error. And this happens in very small populations most. So the founder effect is an example that can cause genetic drift. This is when there's normally a lot of genetic diversity in an original population, but suppose only a small group are sampled, a small group leaves and starts a new colony. Since only a small sample of this large population was taken, and the sample does not represent the original population, it only represents a subset of the population, there will be genetic drift. And in the new colony, right, in the new population, it's not going to represent the same diversity. In this new colony, we eliminated all these other colors that were present in the original population. Right? So that's an example of genetic drift, sampling error. This sample that migrated to a new colony does not represent the original population. So an example of the founder effect is the Amish people of Pennsylvania. So about 200 followers of the Amish denomination came to North America from Switzerland in the 1700s, and only one couple of the 200 happen to have a recessive allele with this syndrome called Ellis-von Creveld syndrome, and it's very, very rare in the population. But because there is a lot of intermarriage between the Amish people, there is a high prevalence of this disorder, and it does not represent, so the incidence of this disease is a lot higher in Amish County, Pennsylvania, Amish Country, Pennsylvania, than it was originally in Switzerland. Right? So this represents how there is a high incidence of the disease in the subgroup more than 2 centuries after the immigrants originally arrived from Europe. Right? So the allele frequencies changed when only a subset of the individuals established a new population. On a much broader scale, the history of human migration out of Africa has really just been a series of founder effects. So about 40 to 70,000 years ago, a subset of people migrated out of southern Africa to Asia. And this was, again, the group that left from Africa and Asia did not represent the entire population, right? So this was a sample made it to Asia. And then from here, only another subgroup ended up making it to the Americas. So each migration divides the genetic variation of the previous population. And as populations become isolated in their new environments, the phenotypes diverge. So this can help explain the unique allele combinations we see in the native occupants of each region around the world. Genetic drift may also result from what's called a population bottleneck. And a bottleneck can occur if there is a disaster or some other event that drastically reduces the size of a population. This bottleneck would randomly eliminate many of the alleles that were present in the larger ancestral population. Right? And even if the few remaining individuals mate and restore the population, the original diversity of alleles would be lost. So an example of this were as in cheetahs. So until 10,000 years ago, cheetahs were common in many areas around the planet. However, today, there are only 2 isolated populations of cheetahs, one in South Africa and one in East Africa. And it's only a few thousand in each population. So between the Ice Age, about 10,000 years ago, and human hunting in the 1800s, we drastically reduced the diversity in the cheetah population. And now the only 2 populations in South and East Africa are very, very genetically related. Within each population, the individuals are nearly genetically identical. You could actually do skin grafts between unrelated cheetahs and they would accept them. That's how genetically related they are. So this is an example, again, of how the loss of genetic diversity could be caused by a population bottleneck, right? And again, it's like where genetic drift is saying that the result at the end does not represent the starting population, right? These new populations of cheetah do not represent the original diversity from which they came from. And in that regard, it's genetic drift. It's sampling error, right? This sample does not represent the larger whole. So that's the end of genetic drift. Another way that evolution could occur is by gene flow. And gene flow moves alleles between populations. And that can affect the allele frequencies in both the original population and the end population. So in the past, geographic barriers separated humans in Europe, leading to separate gene pools. So humans in one part of Europe would not be able to mate with other humans in Europe. Now, there's air travel and trains. So it's very easy for a Spaniard and an Italian to mate. And of course, that causes evolution, or changing allele frequencies in a population is evolution. So because of gene flow, meaning migration, you could cause evolution to occur. And again, this was not as possible in the past because of geographic barriers. Now that we have planes, trains, and automobiles, it's a lot more easy for genes to flow between populations and thus for evolution to occur. So let's watch this brief video to overview all the different mechanisms of evolution.
Evolution is a change in a population's alleles and genotypes from generation to generation. Consequently, evolution must be considered at the population level rather than at the level of the individual organism. There are 5 factors that alter the proportion of homozygotes and heterozygotes in a population: genetic drift, gene flow, mutations, non-random mating, and natural selection. Small populations drawn from a large population may not be representative of the larger gene pool. Genetic drift is the change in the gene pool that occurs in a small population due to chance. 2 situations can lead to genetic drift. Population bottlenecks occur when large numbers of a population are removed by disease, overhunting, overfishing, or natural disasters. The founding of new colonies by a small number of individuals can also result in genetic drift, the founder effect. Gene flow is the movement of alleles from one population to another. This can occur when a member of one population moves into another population. The variety of alleles carried by the new member of the population can significantly affect the gene pool if the new member has good survival and mating capabilities. A mutation is a change in an organism's DNA. This change is transmitted in gametes and immediately changes the gene pool. Although mutations of a particular gene are rare events, the cumulative impact of mutations at many loci can be significant over time. Mutation provides the ultimate source of genetic variability and hence the raw material for evolution. However, by themselves, mutations play a relatively insignificant role in changing allele frequencies in a population. Rather, the fate of the new alleles is more likely to be determined by natural selection and genetic drift. To maintain Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium in the gene pool, matings between individuals must be completely random. Reproduction in which preferred organisms mate can cause an increase in the numbers of homozygous individuals in the population, causing the frequency of genotypes to differ significantly from equilibrium values. Populations consist of individuals with different genetic makeups, some of whom are more successful at leaving offspring than others. For example, some variants blend in with the environment and are less susceptible to predation.
So this brings us to the end of chapter 12. So remember that evolution is nothing more than a change in allele frequencies. We said that at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, there is no change in allele frequencies over time. So if you have a population that's this diverse with all these different allele frequencies, if there's random mating, no migration, genetic drift, mutation, or natural selection, then over time, the allele frequencies will be just the same. However, we know that's usually not the case. We know that oftentimes there is non-random mating, there is genetic drift, there is mutation, and there is natural selection. So these images depict each of those means of evolution. So in natural selection, we say that one type of allele is more adaptive, is more fit than others, right? So individuals that are in light blue have low reproductive success just due to the environment. So that means that over time, over generations, you're going to have more of these dark blue alleles. The genotype with low reproductive success would become less common, and the allele frequencies would change. We know that in mutation, one genotype could become another just randomly. So the allele frequencies will change just because there's the presence of a new genetic variant. Right, so also you should just note how these numbers of allele frequencies are changing in the ancestral population and the later population. We then spoke about genetic drift, where some chance event eliminates some alleles from the population, thus reducing the genetic diversity that was like in the cheetahs over hunting. In non-random mating, we know that certain individuals might have more opportunities to mate than others, so the favored genotypes would become more common. Right? Non-random mating is explained by sexual selection. Right? There are some traits that are favored by the opposite sex in mating. And finally, gene flow talks about how certain alleles may disappear from the population by migration. So suppose some of these genotypes just leave. They go to a different location. Then the remaining genotypes will become more common. So all these taken together are means of changing allele frequencies in populations, which is basically saying these are means of evolution. So I'd like you to finish by watching this extended video on the mechanisms of evolution. It talks about each of the kinds of evolution we spoke about in detail. It's very, very, very helpful to review this at least a couple times. And finally, we said that evolution is a change in a population's gene pool, right? Evolution acts on populations, right, which have a collection of genes and alleles called a gene pool. We know that populations evolve by many different means. We said one is natural selection, one is mutations, genetic drift, non-random mating, and gene flow. Those are all means of evolution. Right? I mean, populations are just a group of interbreeding organisms, each of which has many alleles. If those alleles are generated, new alleles are generated, that's a mutation. If alleles confer adaptive traits that become more common, that's natural selection. If alleles are randomly changed in frequency due to sampling error, that's genetic drift. We know alleles are mixed unevenly in non-random mating, and alleles move between populations in gene flow. And finally, if any of these things happen, we cannot use the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium because evolution does not occur at the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and allele frequencies stay the same from one generation to the next. So that is the end of chapter 12. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time for chapter 13.